Hey guys, hope you're enjoying your weekend. So this video is going to talk about Walt Whitman, give you some background info there, and we're going to get our first taste of poetry for this year. But before we get into that, it's going to be helpful to kind of look at where we've been, what we've been reading, to help us kind of appreciate this era and what we're going into now. So, we started the year pre-1700s. We were looking at the colonization of the land. We were reading Columbus. We were reading Mather. We read some John Smith, things of that nature. And what we were reading was expository in nature. It was informative. It was letters. It was nonfiction. It wasn't really for entertainment. Then we got into our next era, the 1700s to the 1820s, and we were looking at the formation of our country, the creation of the United States. We read Paine, we read some Jefferson, Jonathan Edwards, things like that. And the writing kind of shifted from expository to now it became more persuasive. They were trying to convince people, hey, you need to join up with us. This is what we believe. You should agree with us, things like that. And so you start to see, as you look at the whole, kind of how American literature has been changing over the eras. So we were looking at expository, just purely informative. Then we got into persuasion, and now as this era we're getting into, we're starting to get some new ideas. And so we start to see in the era we're in now, which 1820 to 1865, you have the rise of literature as entertainment. So that's where we got our Hawthornes, our Irvings, Rip Van Winkle, that kind of stuff, Poe. People are writing literature now not just to inform, not just to persuade, but actually to entertain people. We also had a lot of the great thinkers, the great ideas, important things like that. And so that's where we got our Emerson. We read some Lincoln. We talked about Douglas. And so those were informative, not so much about the entertainment aspect, but they're important for their ideas, their thinkers. This era where we're going into now and where we're going to kind of wrap up this era, you start to see the rise of poetry as a form. Not much poetry in American literature prior to this era, but this era you start to have a couple of the bigger names in American literature and bigger names in poetry in general, specifically Walt Whitman. So Whitman was born in 1819. He was raised in Brooklyn and Long Island, so he was a New York kid. He was largely self-taught, and he was actually a teacher himself for a little bit before deciding to devote himself to journalism. So he leaves teaching after a few years. He decides to open a paper. He starts publishing a newspaper, and then in 1855 he self-publishes a book of poetry called Leaves of Grass. And he sends a copy to Emerson. Again, we've read Emerson. Emerson was considered one of the great thinkers of the era. And so Whitman sends him this book of poetry. It's kind of like, hey, you were asking for a poet. You're asking for a great American writer. Here's kind of my attempt. And Emerson really likes Whitman's poetry. Emerson praises it. He writes a really glowing review. Emerson talks to his friends about Whitman. And so Whitman starts to gain some popularity. When the Civil War comes around, Whitman volunteers as a nurse helping out the sick. He heads down to Washington, D.C., helps out there, works a little bit for the government, and then eventually leaves D.C. and settles in New Jersey and kind of lives out the rest of his life. He's considered one of, if not the great American poet. Strangely, not overwhelmingly popular when he was alive, but he was popular when he was alive. But a lot of his recognition came after his death, after some time had passed. So as we're looking at Whitman, as we start getting into poetry, we want to just kind of review some of the basics, some of the things you should be looking at, some of the things that's important to remember. So some of the really basic stuff, you need to remember poetry is broken up into lines and stanzas. There's nothing about paragraphs. Nowhere when you're talking about poetry should you talk about paragraphs. You've got stanzas. So stanzas, this poem here, has 3 stanzas. They're not paragraphs. Don't say paragraphs. And it's broken up by line number. So when you're talking about poetry, you need to say, oh, in line 6, right here, the author uses red to blah, 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 or something like that. So it's line numbers and stanzas. Another important thing to remember is the speaker and the author are 2 different people. So when you talk about the speaker of "Oh Captain, My Captain," you're not talking about Whitman. Whitman is the author. The speaker is a separate entity. So you need to say the speaker of the poem says this. You don't say the author says this. So the author writes, speaker says. So that's an important thing to remember. Alright, so some other stuff as you get into poetry is you need to remember poetry is meant to be read aloud. Poetry is meant to be heard. It's not so much about the reading of poetry. So authors are very intentional with their sounds, how their writing sounds. It's not just the ideas. So some of the things when you're looking at the sound of poetry is you want to look at alliteration. You want to look at assonance. You want to think about the rhythm. How does the poem sound? So when you're looking at alliteration, you're looking at the repetition of consonant sounds, especially at the beginning of words. But it doesn't always have to be at the beginning of words. So if we look over here at From Stopping by Woods by Robert Frost, you have some alliteration around the S sound. Gives his harness bells, ask, some, mistake, sounds, sweep, easy. So that S sound, it's alliterative, it's repeating, and it's used for an effect. So it's not enough just to identify it. You need to think about why. And so this S sound, the S sound gives a soft kind of comforting feeling. And if you read the whole poem, this is just a piece of it, Frost is kind of going for that soft, comforting feeling. Similar to alliteration, you have assonance, which is just a repetition of vowel sounds. And so, using the same excerpt here, you can see some vowel sounds repeating. You have downy and sweep, that long E sound. And when you're talking alliteration, when you're talking assonance, it's not rhyme. So you don't want to just pick words that rhyme and say, oh, those are assonance. It's vowel sounds like these in words that don't rhyme. And then you've got rhythm. Rhythm is the pulse. It's the beat. You guys, a lot of you guys are really into music. You know about rhythm from music. Same thing applies to poetry. You want to think about that pulse, the beat of the poem. From Stopping by Woods, you can really exaggerate it. It's kind of like a heartbeat. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. So there's a rhythm there. And again, it's used for a meaning. So it's not enough just to identify. You want to think about why. Why are they using it? So not just do they use it, but why do they use it? Along with sound, you start to look at some of the deeper meaning things. So denotation, connotation, we've talked about a lot. Denotation, you're talking about your literal definition. Denotation, you're not too concerned about when you're analyzing poetry. When you're analyzing poetry, you want the connotation. It's those implications. It's the associated meanings. It's what does that bring to mind. And so denotation, connotation, you should be pretty familiar with. We also have allusions. This is somewhat of a new term. A lot of times, especially in poetry, you're working in confined spaces. You're working with fewer words, so you need to make every word count. So you might make a reference to a well-known person, an event, a well-known author, something like that. That's an allusion. And you'll see some examples coming up here. Anaphora we've talked about. You've got the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of clauses that come by each other. We read the Native American speech that he kept saying brother at the beginning of each little piece. That's anaphora. Imagery, you guys should know, it's about your senses. And there's 5 types of imagery. So you've got your visual imagery. How does stuff look? You've got your oral imagery, how does it sound? Tactile, how does it feel? Rough, smooth, things like that. Olfactory, that's how do things smell. And gustatory, how do things taste? And so it's no longer enough just to say they use imagery. Now we're getting to the point where we need to start breaking it down. You say things like the author uses oral imagery to, and then you explain why. Again, it always needs to come back to why. Why are they using it? Not just do they use it, but why do they use it? And then the last one we're kind of talking about here is metaphor and symbol. Metaphor and symbol are similar, but they're not the same thing. And that's important to keep in mind. Sometimes students like to use them as the same thing. They're not the same thing. So a metaphor makes a comparison. This right here, his life was an oak tree that had just lost his leaves. That's a metaphor. It's comparing his life to an oak tree without using like or as. So you've got a metaphor. A symbol is simply a representation. So the oak tree here is the symbol. The metaphor is the comparison between his life and the oak tree. And so when you're talking about a metaphor, it's comparing two things. So he uses a metaphor to compare this and this. A symbol represents, the oak tree represents blah, 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 blah. He uses this metaphor to compare an oak tree to the life, things like that. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about and we're going to be looking at as we get into Whitman. So if we look at I'm Still Here by Langston Hughes and kind of see how these terms come together and work. So I've been scarred and battered, my hopes the wind done scattered. Snow has frizzed me, sun has baked me. Looks like between them they done tried to make me stop laughing, stop loving, stop living. But I don't care, I'm still here. And so we've got a few of those terms coming up here. Here, I've been scarred. We've got an illusion. And so remember, an illusion is a reference to a well-known person, a well-known event, a well-known era, something like that. And the I've been scarred and battered, you have an allusion to the unfortunate practice of whipping slaves. So it brings to mind all of the things encompassed in slavery just by that brief little allusion. Battered. This is a good example of connotation. And so battered brings to mind, yes, our speaker's beaten, but he's not broken. If something's battered, it might be really beat up, but it's not broken. It can still go on. And so that's an important word, and that's a connotation thing. It's not the denotation. Snow has frizzed me, sun has baked me. You get some imagery around here. That olfactory, how does it feel? You also have this idea of the sun has baked him, getting into being hardened, being toughened. For those of you guys who are taking art and maybe do pottery, your last step is to fire it in the kiln. It toughens it up, it bakes it, it hardens it. So we have our speaker here who has been hardened. The difficult times with slavery has toughened him up, has given him the resilience to withstand what's going on. You have some anaphora with the stop laughing, stop loving, stop living. It's also alliterative. You've got the S sound and the L sound repeating itself. It's kind of, and that contributes to the rhythm. It's kind of like a march. It's that ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. And so marching, defiance, things like that. So as you're reading Whitman, as you're reading poetry, that's kind of the stuff you're on the lookout for. A lot of kids get a little freaked out by poetry. They see poetry and it scares them. There's a through that helps you read poetry. So the important thing to remember is when you're doing poetry, you don't just read it once. You want to read it a few times. So the first time you read it, you just kind of get the gist. You just go through it, hey, what words don't I know? Does it make sense? What are they kind of talking about? The first time, you don't freak out about understanding a poem the first time through. The second time through, you're going to annotate. That's where you're going to mark it up. You're going to go back, you're going to circle words, you're going to make comments, things like that. You're still not really worried about the interpretation, about the analyzing, about that kind of stuff. You're just marking things, you're just annotating. The third reading is where you dive in. The third reading is where you're going to go make your interpretations, where you're going to go decide, okay, what did I mark? What does it mean? Why does it mean that? And so remember, you're always thinking about the why. If we go back to the Hughes poem, why does he use the stop loving, stop living, stop? Why repeat that S sound? Why repeat that L sound? It gives that marching feeling. Marching associated with discipline, with defiance, with things like that, with order. So you always want to be asking yourself why. It's not enough just to identify. So what you guys are going to is on the blog, under the readings tab, over there on the right, you're going to find the Whitman reading. You need to read "Oh Captain, My Captain," which is Whitman's poem to Abraham Lincoln. So as you're reading through it, you want to keep in mind the captain that Whitman is referring to, that's Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln. So you're going to read "Oh Captain, My Captain," and then you're going to read "Oh Me, Oh Life," which you should recognize from the iPad commercials that have been all over TV with Robin Williams quoting from Dead Poet Society. It's from a Whitman poem. So you're going to read those two. You're going to mark the text. You're going to analyze the poems. Remember, you need to go through them a few times. Read it again and mark it up. Read it again and decide what it means. And then you want to complete the quiz over this video that using your notes. Remember, you can use your notes. No reason not to be getting 100%. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your weekend. If you have questions, feel free to email myself or Mr. Smith, and we'll see you guys next class.